Welcome to Novara Live on a pretty extraordinary day in British politics. Rishi Sunak seems to be intentionally not just trying to lose the election, but perhaps destroy the Conservative Party forever. I'm joined by Helena, aka NoJusticeMTG. What have you been making of the news today?
I mean, it's been an absolutely wild day so far, hasn't it? I mean, it looks like Rishi is just desperate to grab his green card and jet off back to California, but, you know, he may just be terrible at this whole politics thing.
We will, of course, be talking you through the whole controversy. We'll also then take a look at a sneak preview of the new Labour Manifesto. Some details have been leaked, and a prominent left-wing commentator has been fired from their job in the United States for being pretty critical of Israel. Pretty shocking. This was always going to be a tough election for the Tories after a decade of austerity, then COVID, then an energy crisis, then Liz Truss. The country was always going to be desperate for change. And even a talented Tory leader would struggle to turn back that tide. But Rishi Sunak is not a talented leader. And if the last 24 hours are anything to go by, he is in fact the most incompetent politician to ever stand for election in Britain. Now, how do we know this? Because yesterday, on the 80th anniversary of the D-Day landings in Normandy, Sunak left a commemoration event attended by world leaders to pre-record an interview with ITV. Now, that left David Cameron to stand in for the Prime Minister, posing here for a photo with Joe Biden, Macron, and German Chancellor Scholz. So, notably absent. The decision has inevitably been read as a slight against the brave soldiers who took part in the D-Day landings. The reaction to it, so sort of this news sort of arrived last night and there was sort of a cascade of responses. What the hell was he thinking? No one, though, summarised the disquiet or the perplexity at what Rishi Sunak had done better than Conservative commentator Tim Montgomery, who was speaking on Newsnight.
My head in my hands. I don't understand it. Look, I don't want to prejudge this. If there is something in like Rishi Sunak's family that he had to come back for, we do not know for sure.
No, but Paul Brand is saying that he did come back.
Well, if he came back for, if he came back for an interview,
today was
a political interview from the D-Day commemorations, that is indefensible.
So
absolutely indefensible.
Paul Brand, to be clear,
yeah,
is saying that is the slot that ITV was offered. That was the slot that Sunak's team offered.
Well, I really am. Before I came on this programme, I thought this would come up. I rang all of the contacts I could in Downing Street, saying to give me some sort of ammunition to use tonight, and I've got no response. I don't think they know how to defend what has happened. Unless it is a personal tragedy, and I believe what you just said, it's extraordinary that the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, at a time where the King, you know, he's advanced his medical treatment, so he was there. Mm-hmm. This is going to be the last commemoration where survivors, a big commemoration where survivors will be present. I think it's political malpractice of the highest order if Rishi Sunak absented himself for an election interview on ITV.
It's not very prime ministerial, is it?
Well, it's just not dignified. It's not the right thing to do at a fundamental level.
The reason why I started with that reaction is I suppose, you know, I imagine most of you in the audience, myself, have a deep respect and gratitude for the people who took part in those D-Day landings. They were fighting for a just cause. They were risking their lives. Lots of them kids at the time. Lots of them died, right? We do owe them a great gratitude. But the idea of sort of giving commemoration or remembrance to the people who fought in the Second World War, it's not the sort of the usual issue that really makes left-wing people incredibly passionate, right? Now, because I suppose left-wing people, you're more likely to sort of see the victims of Britain's wars as quite similar to the victims of other wars, right? Whereas if you're a conservative, then you have this sort of special reverence towards people who died for Britain. And I think you are really seeing lots of the passionate disquiet at what Rishi Sunak had done, not from, you know, the traditional opponents of the Conservative Party, but from within the Conservative Party itself, because of the issue he chose to sort of display his disrespect. Tim Montgomery's reaction has been shared by pretty much everyone in Britain. And Rishi Sunak was forced into an apology this morning. So he initially tweeted it. So he said, the 80th anniversary of D-Day has been a profound moment to honour the brave men and women who put their lives on the line to protect our values, our freedom and our democracy. This anniversary should be about those who made the ultimate sacrifice for our country. The last thing I want is for the commemorations to be overshadowed by politics. That's why I came home to do a political interview. That was me adding that, by the way, if you're listening to it on the podcast. I care deeply about veterans and have been honoured to represent the UK at a number of events in Portsmouth and France over the past 2 days and to meet those who fought so bravely. And he said, after the conclusion of the British event in Normandy, I returned back to the UK. On reflection, it was a mistake not to stay in France longer, and I apologise. So on reflection, after everyone started shouting at me, I realised it was probably a mistake. Rishi Sunak has been speaking to the TV cameras, and he later in the day gave this comment to Sky.
The itinerary for this set of events was set weeks ago, before the election campaign even began. So I don't think it's right to politicise these things. I stuck to the itinerary that had been set for me as Prime Minister weeks ago, before the election, fully participated, expressed my gratitude to the veterans.
No shame at all.
As I said, on reflection, it was a mistake not to stay longer, and I've apologised for that. But I also don't think it's right to be political in the midst of D-Day commemorations. The focus should rightly be on the veterans and their service and sacrifice for our country.
It's the veterans who are saying that you're letting the country down. Are they politicising this?
No, I've apologised for not staying longer. On reflection, that was a mistake.
So he's saying people should not politicise this, right? He didn't come back to do government business. He came back early because he wanted to do an interview with ITV where he called Keir Starmer. Well, I think he was defending himself against claims that he was a liar for coming up with the whole 200 or $2,000 tax Labour hike that he made up, right? So he came back for completely political reasons. In fact, elsewhere in the interview, he sort of said, this had nothing to do with the election. I'd been planning for ages to leave halfway through, which does beg the question, why was he going to leave halfway through when Macron wasn't, when Scholz wasn't, when Biden wasn't? What made Rishi Sunak's time so important that unlike any of the other leaders of the world, even without an election, he would have dipped out halfway through? Doesn't make much sense. Sam Coates, in fact, put comments from a D-Day veteran to Rishi Sunak.
These men made the ultimate sacrifice, and you couldn't even sacrifice a whole afternoon. Ken Hay, a 98-year-old D-Day veteran, told us that you let the country down. Is he right?
I participated in events both in Portsmouth and in France over 2 days because this is an incredibly important moment for our country to commemorate the sacrifice of all of those and their service. And it was a real honour and a privilege to meet many veterans and speak to them and their families, hear their stories, express my gratitude to them, and build on our record of making sure that this is the best country in the world for veterans.
Honestly, you didn't care, did you?
No, I cared deeply.
Then why didn't you stay?
As I said, the itinerary for these events was set weeks ago before the general election campaign. I participated in events both in Portsmouth and in France, and having fully participated in all the British events with British veterans, I returned home before the International Leaders event. That was a mistake, and I apologise for that.
Yeah, so that's why he was saying that sort of this had been in his diary for ages. He was only ever going to stay for the British events. Why bother commemorating the Americans who died trying to liberate Europe? That would be inappropriate. Or I suppose there were French and Belgians, though those were occupied, weren't they? But maybe there were some French people in Britain who landed on D-Day. It was principally Brits and Americans who landed in Normandy on that day. Yeah, catastrophe. What was he thinking? Right, Rishi Sunak does seem to be, trying to offend pretty much every demographic in Britain. Like to young people, he said, I'll send you on national service. To older people who, have real veneration for people who died in the Second World War, he dips out halfway through from a commemoration event, from a D-Day commemoration event. Like, what's he going to do next? Punch a nurse, right? Shake hands with a paedophile. What can you do to offend more people in Britain than what Rishi Sunak has already done during this general election campaign? Burn a £50 note. That's what I can imagine next, actually. Keir Starmer, for his part, stayed for the whole event, and he said this about Rishi Sunak leaving early.
Rishi Sunak's apologised. Do you believe his apology?
Look, he'll have to answer for his choices. For me,
He's apologised. Those are his words. Do you believe it?
He'll have to answer for his own choices. For me, the only choice was to be there. It was a humbling day to contemplate the bravery individually of those, many of them teenagers, running up the beach under gunfire, not knowing whether they would succeed or fail, and then to sort of think about how hard that must have been, to then see the veterans and say, thank you. I thank them on behalf of the Labour Party and the country, and on behalf of my children, actually, who were freely going to school yesterday because of the contribution that they made, the sacrifice they made in their colleagues. For me, it was really important to be there for the whole day, paying my respects. That was the only choice I was going to make. The Prime Minister really will have to answer for his choices.
So when I first listened to that, I was thinking, what has D-Day got to do with your kids going to secondary school? Obviously, if the Germans had won the Second World War, that would have been absolutely appalling, but people probably still would have gone to school. But then I realised, I think his wife is Jewish, so I don't know what her background is. But obviously, if Hitler hadn't been defeated, then they already killed 2/3 of the Jews in Europe. So maybe they would have killed more. I don't know what his partner's heritage is, but I was wondering if that's sort of how that line was motivated. Of course, in a political sense, this is just an absolute gift to Keir Starmer. He gets to sort of stand up and say, "I'm the patriotic one. I'm respectful of soldiers." Not Keir Starmer. Rishi Sunak just doesn't give a damn, right? Which is how most of the country are interpreting this. It was also Rishi Sunak's sort of snub to the soldiers was also a gift to Nigel Farage.
If he doesn't understand how vitally important D-Day is in terms of our country, its history, it is one of our top ever achievements. And it's something that runs right through the generations in this country, that we did something truly remarkable. It's at the edge of living memory. This was the last time ever there'll be a gathering of veterans on parade in Normandy. And if he's not prepared to go to the international commemoration with the heads of so many different countries, overlooking a beach in which our American allies lost thousands of men, that says a lot about him. He is completely disconnected from the centre of this country, and he's proved to me that he basically is not a patriotic leader of the Conservative Party.
Yeah, I saw someone tweet today that something that Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak seem to have, which is fairly unique actually for prime ministers, is they have no sense of history. they just don't seem, and I don't think I'd make a good prime minister. I'm not sure I'm particularly well attuned to sort of those issues that sort of really are incredibly emotive for your sort of median British voter. But if you're a prime minister, you're supposed to be. Gordon Brown, Tony Blair, even Boris Johnson in a sense. I mean, I suppose he didn't appeal to people's idea of fair play, but he did sort of, I think he would have understood that this was a significant moment. But Sunak and Truss before him, they just don't seem to get it. That opportunity to call Sunak unpatriotic is, of course, a massive gift to Farage. Farage will already be feeling pretty confident, by the way, before tonight's debate. That's because the last poll from YouGov had Reform on only 2 points behind the Conservatives. So the Tories are on 19, Reform on 17. Helena, might this gaffe, this snub, might this flip that? Do you think we could be seeing in the next couple of days Reform overtaking the Tories because Rishi Sunak has decided to snub the people that sort of the core Tory Reform base really care about, which is World War II veterans?
I mean, I wouldn't rule it out. Of course, the Conservative Party seem to be pulling out all the stops to try and ensure that they get completely destroyed at this election. And Nigel Farage seems to know that too. And this might be the worst political campaign in a general election in history. I genuinely cannot think of anything worse than this. People are making comparisons to like Theresa May and Boris Johnson, but they didn't do anything as bad as this. They didn't have as bad a history as this. They didn't have the kind of this massive kind of dearth of support. In fact, Theresa May was kind of wooden in comparison to somebody who was kind of more kind of popular on the campaign trail, and a bit kind of robotic. Whereas Rishi Sunak, on top of being robotic, on top of being out of touch, on top of just being terrible at politics, he's also extremely unlikable and also does loads of things that make the population hate him. I genuinely can't think of anybody doing worse than this. And Reform UK, as you say, are very likely to be a large beneficiary of this gigantic, this election-defining faux pas that Rishi Sunak is engaged in right here, as the party, as you say, who represent an older demographic who have a lot of reverence for World War II veterans, and to which patriotism and nationalist patriotism, is a really kind of defining characteristic of what shapes their politics, what really does shape the kind of political issues that they care about. But it's even worse than that. It's even worse than that, because actually I think generally, when you look at polling numbers and you look at focus groups, you look at broad opinions in this country, we are a pretty patriotic country, even if we are kind of sarcastically self-denigrating of the country that we belong to. In terms, we have this kind of what Luke Troll from More in Common would call a kind of soft patriotism. It's not flags flying everywhere. It's not singing the national anthem American style. We find that pretty gauche in the UK. But what runs through the whole of our society is a kind of reverence for loads of kind of bits of British heritage that we all agree are really important to us as a country that has a lot of history, especially on the world stage. And nothing exemplifies this more than what we did during the Second World War. And this transcends political boundaries in this country. Even the most left-wing of left-wingers would still understand the important role that we played in defeating Nazi Germany. Because, of course, we view it from an internationalist perspective rather than a kind of nationalist perspective. But it doesn't matter what kind of part of the British political system that you come from. If you're politically disengaged, if you're somebody who is kind of floating between the parties, and Labour have clearly tried to make themselves into a position absolutely to mop up this vote by putting the flags on all of their campaign material, by having Keir Starmer do all of these kind of pre-recorded bits and pieces to try and make them represent that kind of soft patriotism in this country. So Sunak will lose votes to everybody. It cannot be understated just how much of a terrible gaffe this is in terms of the broader kind of political status of this country, because it really cuts deep at something all of us generally think would be something that we personally would have reverence for. One thing I will say is that this might be the coverage that we have of this from our media seems to be kind of overshadowing the event almost in a way. But on top of that, let's compare this. Of course, this is correct criticism, but there wasn't the same kind of criticism when the BBC replaced the footage of Boris Johnson laying a wreath incorrectly, I believe it was. When you also compare that to the hysteria around Michael Foot's donkey jacket, which wasn't that at all, you're still there to do the commemoration, or them getting out their protractors to measure Jeremy Corbyn's bow. It literally has to take leaving halfway through to try and do an interview with ITV that takes our media to a position where they will properly, take a Conservative parliamentary or prime ministerial candidate to task for a gaffe of this magnitude when you compare it to how they've covered the left in this country.
Yeah, no, I think that's all correct. We've talked about the politics of Rishi Sunak missing this. Of course, it's only a big political gaffe because so many people feel so strongly about the sacrifice people made on D-Day. So in the Battle of Normandy, 73,000 Allied forces were killed and 153,000 were wounded. And as Tim Montgomery said in that clip we showed you at the beginning of this segment, this event was likely to be the last major event with survivors still able to attend. One of those was a 99-year-old named Joe Mines. His regiment had been tasked with clearing mines on D-Day. That was as the Germans retreated. So as the Germans retreated, they were trying to clear the landmines that would have blown up sort of the British and American, the Allied troops. He was at the D-Day event. He was too frail to speak, so his words were read out by the actor Martin Freeman.
Joe Mines, clearing mines. One of our fellas trod on one and blew his leg off. The whole leg went. War is brutal. Back when I signed up, I met a fella on the train. I went to Normandy with him, but he got killed within about an hour of landing here. He was only young. I was 19 when I landed, but I was still a boy. I don't care what people say. I wasn't a man, I was a boy. And I didn't have any idea of war and killing. I was lucky. Yeah, I had lots and lots of luck. So why would I come back? Well, this is the last and only opportunity for me. The last there will ever be. And it's because of the lads. I want to pay my respects to those who didn't make it. May they rest in peace.
Difficult not to be moved by that. You can see why this is sort of so emotive for British people, for the British electorate. Another D-Day veteran, Ken Hay, told Sky what he thought of Sunak leaving the event early.
What can you say? They're politicians. They're politicians. I don't have a great regard for politicians. He lets the country down. You know, it's not representation of how we're trying to weld things together to keep the peace. I mean, it's bad enough with Putin coming in and the Chinese possibly doing it in not necessarily in warfare, but in other forms. And what are we doing? We bail out, let them get on with it. Because I want to stand in the election, I want my seat back.
He's not impressed by Rishi. He doesn't have any faith in politicians anyway. But he's gone back to do this political interview instead of paying respect. This is going to be a real big problem. Well, I mean, it already is a very, very big problem for Rishi Sunak. Senior figures from the Labour Party and the trade unions today attended a crunch meeting to sign off Labour's election manifesto. The document will not be released until next Thursday, but a few key details have already been released or briefed to The Guardian. So this is a headline from The Guardian. Keir Starmer expected to push for Palestinian state in Labour manifesto. Labour policy likely to irritate Israel, whose Prime Minister reacted angrily when Ireland, Spain and Norway officially recognised Palestine in May. Now, this is a headline that Labour will be very happy with, presumably why they sort of briefed it to The Guardian. Labour are concerned about disquiet from Muslim voters especially over their position on Gaza and are hoping, I presume, that this might shore up their support. I think the headline gives them too much credit, though, because the policy itself seems far from bold. So The Guardian write this. People with knowledge of the document say the Labour leader is expected to include a pledge to recognise Palestine before the end of any peace process and to make sure such a move does not get vetoed by a neighbouring country. So sort of in this Guardian headline, they're sort of comparing this policy with Ireland, Spain and Norway. But Ireland, Spain and Norway recognised the state of Palestine immediately, as, by the way, the majority of the world's nations have. It's only sort of a select group of countries in the West who have sort of said, no, we're not going to recognise it yet. So Labour's policy to recognise a Palestinian state at some point before a peace agreement, and that's very vague. I mean, it's barely a commitment, right? There isn't going to be a peace agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians, I mean, for decades, to be fair, I imagine. So this idea that they will recognise Palestine at some point, and we're not going to wait for a peace agreement, but, you know, it could be 5 years, 10 years, maybe it'd be 50 years. I mean, it doesn't sound like much of a commitment to me, but these are the headlines they're looking for. As for other policies, so the whole manifesto is going to be published on Thursday, as far as we understand, but The Guardian does have some more details. So they write, Labour sources say it will be a cautious package of measures without many retail policy announcements, unlike the more policy-heavy manifestos the party published under Jeremy Corbyn in 2017 and 2019. One source who has seen the draft manifesto document said, quote, everybody's incredibly concerned about making any financial commitments because the Conservatives can weaponise that. But if you don't have any funding, you're not going to have any policies. In moves that are likely to delight trade unions, Labour is considering a promise to lower the retirement age for ambulance workers as a way to boost recruitment and retention. Labour officials have indicated that doing so could be a precursor to similar moves for other NHS workers in what would be a relatively low-cost way to improve staffing levels. It will also include guarantees on workers' rights, recruiting more teachers and driving down net migration, though without a specific target. The manifesto will promise to allow military identification to be used at polling stations, but will not promise to abolish voter ID altogether. The document will not include a commitment to remove the government's two-child benefit cap, despite pressure from many in the party, though it is likely to include a promise to do so as a priority as soon as financially possible. It will focus heavily on security, including an image of Starmer in combat uniform. Now, if they want Keir Starmer to be associated with the military, a picture in the manifesto is not going to go as far as Rishi Sunak missing the end of a D-Day commemoration when Keir Starmer stayed. So the work's been done for them there. As far as I understand, Unite, sort of reports are saying, have not voted for this to be the manifesto. So at Clause 5 meetings, they're called, what you have is you have sort of the shadow cabinet there. You have some representatives of the shadow cabinet, some representatives of Labour backbenchers, the NEC, trade union leaders, and they all get together and basically rubber stamp the document. Now, at times, there's like lots of wrangling. So I think when Corbyn was leader, it was understood that sort of, people would bring different things and then they'd all negotiate it and horse trade, and then you'd end up with a document. Obviously, in 2019, it was quite a messy document. I mean, this time the understanding is that Keir Starmer's advisors have written a brief document, and all the other people who attend the meeting get to say, I mean, they're all told to say yes, essentially, but Unite have disagreed with the process. Reports suggest, and they voted against it, but obviously that wasn't enough to stop this going through. Helena, do you have high hopes for the manifesto, which will be published, we understand, next week?
Well, considering that the Labour Party have all of their campaign documentation, all of their campaign material with the single word change plastered over everything, and then you will look at the actual things that they are purporting to be this said change, it doesn't seem very convincing to me. When there are things here that are good. There are plenty of things that they have said so far that are better than what they would be from the Conservative Party, that represent a very incremental amount of change, right? But when it comes to things like saying, well, we're going to reduce the retirement age for ambulance drivers, I'm like, that's good. Like, I'm glad that's in there, but the Guardian's editorializing of this as a delight for the trade unions rather than, having a proper agreement on pay for NHS staff, which really and truly is the fulcrum with which our retention and recruitment crisis in the NHS staff is based upon. If it's a fly in the ointment, really, so a pretty more existential problem. Obviously, we've heard loads of other bits of policy information up to this point, as well as these revelations that I'm sure will be in the manifesto. Again, these things also don't represent like a particularly large break from the kind of politics that we have experienced over the last 14 years on loads of really key issues. I have been personally, I'm very policy brained myself, bit of a wonk. And my central criticism of the Labour Party, outside of the factional stuff internally that's made me want to disengage with them, is that the policy is just not good enough. Like, loads of these policies aren't good enough. And they will try and market them as being far more important than they really are. Like this Palestine pledge that we've talked about. The wording is already pretty waffly. It's already pretty non-committal. And when Starmer was questioned on this by Beth Rigby, he continues to actually not be very committal to this idea that we might potentially undermine the relationships that we have diplomatically with Israel to be able to get that through and get them recognized. It's almost like they're deliberately trying to water that down in terms of any solidity to the policy to ensure that people can project what they want to see on that policy when they are going to the voting booth rather than actually looking at the wording of it. What it does show at the very least that they want the Palestine pledge of recognition to be the forefront of what we're discussing with regards to this manifesto, is that it just does show you, they are worried about losing the votes of people who come from pro-Palestine communities, from people who are ideologically pro-Palestine, and they're willing to change their position on this to try and court those people's votes. Just shows you, just giving up and saying, well, I'm going to vote Labour no matter what because we've got to get the Tories out, means that they will ignore you for policy. They have seen people desert them over Palestine, therefore they are trying to at least somewhat change their position, or at least their rhetoric and their outward ideological base on this one, to try and court those people's votes again. So it just shows you how much removing your vote, or like withholding your vote until you see some change, gets you in terms of policy direction for a mainstream political party. But at the end of the day, it's just lots of tinkering. It's just tinkering around the sides of loads of existential problems that our country faces. One of the discussions we've had over the last couple of days, that's been pushed by the Institute for Fiscal Studies, is the idea that no political party, at least in the mainstream, is being honest about the macroeconomic state of this country, the financial state of this country moving forward, and if they are going to ensure that we only ever engage in fiscal expansion when it's for investment in new assets for the state, we are still going to have this gigantic budget shortfall to keep service provision the same as as it is at the moment, without cuts elsewhere or indeed with higher taxes. And both parties are lying on this. And it's clear that this policy document is not going to have anything in like that because they've promised not to. And nothing's been released up until this point. And that, for me, is a red line. It's a red line for me that Starmer still railroaded the meeting for Clause 5 to ensure that they didn't have any promises to reverse the 2-child benefit cap, which is going to keep 500,000 children in poverty. So on really important things that this country needs to see change, they are not offering that change personally for me. And this is where I think this document falls short and why I don't have much high hopes for it.
I suppose we'll see the whole manifesto next week. Just for now, I want to go back to the sort of Palestine point, because on Labour's concern about Muslim voters, there's some recent interesting analysis from The Economist. The magazine has looked at all the seats where Labour are directing canvassers, so where they're saying, please go and knock on doors here, and they found they all have one of two things in common. So what they have in common? Either they are seats where the Tories won by a relatively small amount in 2019, so your sort of standard target seat, you can see those here, the blue dots, or they are seats which the Labour Party already holds, but which have a high South Asian population. So those are dots in the red. Now, some of those have really big majorities. So Bradford West, Labour won by over 50 percentage points in 2019. But because, well, we presume because it has a South Asian population of over 50%, Labour is sending people out there to knock on doors because they think you could get huge swings in these places of people who are annoyed about the Labour's, pretty outrageous position on the Gaza war, as we've discussed so many times on this show. Of course, with polling as it is, you might think door knockers might not make too much of a difference in this election. It's going to be a Labour landslide. But it is analysis like this that shows why Labour will be seeking a few belated headlines about their tepid support for Palestine before polling day. They want to sort of say, oh, we've changed. We're no longer saying it's brilliant and righteous for Israel to starve kids. Now we're sort of going to make some very small sort of steps, a little bit of outreach here to say that actually we do care about Palestinian lives. A little bit too late for some, I think. A prominent left-wing commentator has been fired from US outlet The Hill after her critical reporting of Israel. Briahna Joy Gray has until today hosted a show called The Rising, which she co-hosts with a right-wing commentator named Robbie Sove. So the idea of the show is fairly interesting, actually. It's to facilitate debate. It often gets heated between the left-wing and the right-wing host. To get an idea, this is an example from soon after October the 7th.
It is interesting that there have been no calls to censor. It's not the same for the President of the United States, obviously, but to even ask for an apology or a personal retraction from Joe Biden after lying about the 40 beheaded babies that have yet to materialize. His campaign, his administration got away with putting a retraction out to the press without him ever, as I understand it to date, being asked about why he specifically averred that he had seen evidence of something that even the IDF... Even the IDF said that they had no evidence of.
That's not true. It's been shared on social media. The Israeli government has said this is the picture we've shown Joe Biden.
That is literally not. That is not true, Robbie.
It is absolutely true. How many times do you have to see pictures of blown apart children before you concede that they exist?
I see pictures of blown apart children every single day, Robbie. They're Palestinian children. What I have not
So you're saying there are no Israeli blown apart children? What is wrong with you?
Now, of course, Briahna Joy Gray was correct in that clip. Her co-host was wrong. And Briahna has continued to apply her critical eye to the Gaza war, highlighting Israeli atrocities in Gaza, questioning official narratives from Israel and their allies, and highlighting Western duplicity in Israel's genocidal war. And it's an approach which has gained The Hill lots of views. So a recent video hosted by Joy Gray highlighting anti-Palestinian racism by talk show host Bill Maher has 176,000 views. That was just in 2 days. A popular video from last week criticised Joe Biden walking back from his supposed red line on Rafah. So you've seen lots of people watching this, critical coverage of Israel. However, late this Thursday, Briahna Joy Gray revealed that she had been fired by The Hill. So she tweeted this, and it seems like she's been fired in a somewhat unceremonious way. So Briahna Joy Gray's tweet, "It finally happened. The Hill has fired me. There should be no doubt that the Rising Hill, or the Hill Rising, has a clear pattern of suppressing speech, particularly when it's critical of the state of Israel. This is why they fired Katie Halper, and it was only a matter of time before they fired me." And you can see this email. It's very abrupt. Notice of contract termination. Dear Briahna Joy, this is a 30-day written notice that your consulting services agreement is being terminated pursuant to the provisions of Section 5.3 for convenience. Thank you for your contributions and we wish the best in your future endeavours. Sincerely yours, Next Star Media. Now, she's been presenting this show for a few years, I think, and just a couple of sentences. Nah, you're sacked. Sorry, bye-bye. She mentioned Katie Halper in the tweet. She's another left-wing commentator who was fired from The Hill. In that case, that was after she called on progressives to commit to dismantling Israeli apartheid. Again, so a very reasonable position. So what precipitated Joy Gray losing her job? Well, the decision to fire Gray comes after this video of her went viral.
Thank you, me too. And I really hope that you specifically will believe women when they say that they got hurt.
All right, thanks for joining. Stick around, more Rising coming up next.
That video was shared by Israeli influencer Hen Mazig, who tweeted it with this commentary. The Hill's Briahna Joy Gray rolling her eyes and sighing after Yarden Gonen, sister of a hostage in Gaza, asking her to believe rape victims. No low, this person won't sink to. Truly disgusting. Now, Hen Mazig is a troll. I've been on Piers Morgan with him. He's just constantly trying to change the subject. Very disingenuous, very, very cynical guy. I have to admit, though, when I first saw that clip, I did find it a little bit uncomfortable, right? So I should be clear, I understood why Briahna Joy Gray rolled her eyes when that was sort of said to her by that guest. Briahna is one of the few commentators who has been brave enough to question the dodgy reporting from the likes of the New York Times about alleged systematic rape committed by Hamas. She gets flack for that all the time, and that attack was being repeated there, right? So I can see why she's like, this again. However, I think most people watching that will think such a dismissive response might seem inappropriate when, you're not just talking to a right-wing troll, you're talking to someone whose sister is currently being taken hostage, right? So you probably should avoid rolling your eyes in that situation. However, though, I did go back and look at the full context of this. And when you see the whole interview, it does give you a sort of a different image of what had happened, because the guest did say a lot of things that were just completely untrue.
I think the question is, so many other hostage families who've been protesting Netanyahu seem to believe that what would help their family members come home sooner is if Netanyahu would agree to a ceasefire and a hostage release deal to really prioritize what you're saying. Prioritize getting your sister home where she can be safe and have the medical attention it seems that she very much needs.
You're very right, but sometimes throughout those deals, we saw that Hamas wasn't agreeing anything at all. Right now, we have a new deal that the Israeli administration put on the table that Biden is vouching her this deal. And I'm really hopeful that Hamas will show the world that he cares about his own citizens and will say yes to this deal. Because if they say no, I'm really hopeful that everyone can see the true face of terror.
So the guest there, sort of as Briahna was pointing out, there are lots of families of hostage victims who have sort of said, we really want Netanyahu to agree to a ceasefire. They're protesting him. Whereas this guest that she was speaking to on the Hill was essentially saying, no, this is all Hamas's fault. We just need all of your support to sort of defeat these terrorists. Now, of course, it's not a reason to be rude to someone whose sister is being held hostage, but I do think that lots of untruths are actually being said by this guest, including there. So she's saying it's Hamas standing in the way of a ceasefire. That ignores, of course, that it's Israel who are pushing back against the ceasefire plan outlined by Joe Biden. Hamas have said so long as the ceasefire is permanent, they're willing to sign it. So that suggestion from the guest, it's all Hamas's fault. Israel is looking for peace. Why won't everyone just rally around and put even more pressure on the terrorists? The guest speaking to Briahna also relied on some pretty discredited sources.
I don't know if you know Zaka organization, but they have the worst pictures of what Hamas has done to the women during the October 7th attack.
Yeah,
And
unfortunately, we are very familiar with Zaka, but regrettably, the reporting has been roundly discredited by both Israeli and American media sources. So I really would like to bring this back to your sister specifically. And I want to ask you about what you make of new reports.
Because I saw the pictures with my own eyes. And when you will have a sister in a terror organization's hand, you will know the feeling of terrifying every minute of every day. Can't sleep at night, can't even drink a sip of water because I know that my sister is drinking salt water from the sea, that she's not getting food and the terrorist is eating in front of her face.
Yeah, Yardin, I really hope your sister does get water and food, and I hope that I'm sure you're aware of the ample reporting of Israel blocking aid, food and water to Gaza in a way that is hurting both the people of Gaza and the hostages, right?
Most of the trucks are getting inside Gaza. I don't know if you saw, but Hamas is blocking them from them civilians. They're not giving their own civilians the humanitarian aid that everyone is so eager to give them.
So you can see why Briahna Joy Gray is getting frustrated right there. She's got a guest who is just saying Israeli talking point after Israeli talking point after Israeli talking point. We know what they've done because we've heard from Zaka. Now, as you'll have seen from sort of previous shows we've done, so much of what Zaka said, this voluntary first responder group, has been completely discredited. There was a really good Al Jazeera documentary, and we interviewed the producer. He spoke to or interviewed this guy from Zaka saying lots of the things that you've sort of said happened. I think they'd sort of said that there was a fetus ripped out of a pregnant woman's stomach. He said that this can't be true because it doesn't sort of line up with the other evidence we've got. And he says, no, I've got a picture of it. It shows, the host a picture and says that picture doesn't show that at all. Right? So it does seem like Zaka are not in any way people who should be trusted, but it's just repeated there. And then says, oh no, Israel are really committed to giving all the people of Palestine food. It's just Hamas blocking it. So, I can see why as a host you'd be getting very frustrated by listening to, all this bullshit essentially. And the interview. So, at the beginning we showed you that small clip which went viral and everyone's saying, this is completely outrageous. How can she be so disrespectful as to roll her eyes to sort of a family member of a victim of hostage taking, right? And when you look at that 14-second clip, some people will think, oh, that did seem a little bit disrespectful to someone in a difficult sort of position. But let's show you that in context. So this is how the interview ended with, what I think can only be called a bit of a rant.
If the world won't help us, we will see 9/11 a second time in the US as well. But we can already see in the United States, in Michigan, rallies that's calling death to America, not condemning terror organizations in Israel or any other place. In fact, is reflecting to your country as well.
I'm just going to push back against the implication that in Michigan, which has the largest Muslim and Arab population in America, that there is any threat of terrorism from our own people. And I would like to clarify also that one of the rationale that was presented for 9/11 was discussed with America's support of Israel's continued occupation of Palestine. So that's neither here nor there. I really do hope that Netanyahu agrees and Israel agrees to the ceasefire deal that could bring all the hostages, including your sister, home. And I'm sure many people watching are praying for her safety.
Thank you. Me too. And I really hope that you specifically will believe women when they say that they got hurt.
All right. Thanks for joining. Stick around. More Rising coming up next.
So that 11-second clip that people watch, which actually makes it look like, Briahna Joy Gray ended the interview early, which she absolutely did not. And you saw the eye roll. It had come after this rant where, after spouting a load of untruths, this person says, if we don't defeat Hamas now, you're going to have another 9/11 in America, and everyone in, this heavily Muslimly, this state with a large Muslim population is protesting to call for Hamas to win and the hostages to be, loads and loads of nonsense. So you can see why Briahna Joy had that reaction. I don't think the 14-second clip being shared by all of these Israeli talking heads is in any way representative.
I think the main thing that came across from me, from the full clip that you see, is just this I'm just so tired, again, of this narrative that we get, where it's just, this conflict is just between the West and the East. If you don't support what Israel is doing in Gaza, etc., then eventually all of the people that we believe to be the bulwark against, for example, as the America's outpost in the Middle East, they're all going to come for you. There'll be another 9/11. These are people who you cannot mix with Western society. None of these things are true. I mean, this is the same things that Isaac Herzog was saying in interviews with people like Laura Kuenssberg, and it's clear, again, this is part of the kind of Hasbara narrative that you get. And it's frustrating because I do feel for this woman. Obviously, we all feel for all of the hostages, all the families of the hostages. And when it comes to things like, for example, like the rape issue with regards to the Israel-Hamas war, in that whilst obviously we've all seen how it's been discredited, the idea of systemic rape being used on October the 7th, part of the ICC chief prosecutor's letter wanting to have a warrant for the arrest of people like Sinwar and Daif from Hamas clearly shows that the UN has reasons to believe that there is good evidence that rapes were committed against hostages in captivity specifically. Again, we don't know which particular group that was by or whether it's been used systemically or not. But that's something that that's clearly going to be an issue. I can understand why she is upset given the position that she's in and why this emotive clip can go viral. But just as always, with all of the kind of pro-Israel propaganda, context gets removed. The full understanding of any kind of issue gets presented only in an emotive manner rather than a factual manner. And that removal of context is part of the ways in which this narrative continually gets pushed. And at the end of the day, it's led to people like Briahna Joy Gray losing her job over one eye roll. Obviously, that shouldn't be things that should be happening. But again, the right keeps talking about how they cancel culture, yet here they are engaging in it themselves.
Yeah, I mean, this is also, the costs are so much high. If you make a tiny mistake, rolling your eyes, right? If you're pro-Palestine, then you get sacked, right? We showed you at the beginning of that clip that there was the guy saying, Briahna, what are you talking about? Blah, blah, blah. Well, he was just saying lie after lie after lie after lie after lie. So if you're on the pro-Israeli side, you can make so many mistakes. You can tell so many untruths, and your job is never going to be under threat. If you're on the pro-Palestine side, even a facial expression can get you fired, right? Which essentially seems to be what happened here. You've got people who are broadcasting an hour every day. Someone's looking at every sort of minute of what you're doing to find a facial expression they don't like. And if you make a wrong face expression, then you're fired, right? The stakes are just so much higher if you have the temerity to be critical of Israel than they are if you're like a cheerleader for the American and the Israeli position. I think that's what's totally unjust and unfair here. Thank you so much, Helena, for joining me on tonight's show.
Absolute pleasure. It's been a while since we've co-hosted together, and as I always enjoy it when we do. So thank you very much.
Always a pleasure to have you on. You've been watching Novara Media. Good night.